Thank you very much for inviting me here. My name is Ken Kriz. I'm a professor at UIS. I also am testifying as a person who's served on the investment committee of a number of city pension plans and also was on the advisory board for the supplemental retirement plan for the university. So I've been doing research on pensions for over 20 years and have practical experience that's about 15 years worth. So, and I want to thank you for inviting me. Again, I'm testifying as a neutral. I take no position on the bill or the original restrictions. I was just asked to come and talk about some of the potential effects as far as the research has shown. So, first slide. So, I'm sure that you kind of know this, but I just wanted to make sure, when I was a pension trustee, I did take an oath of fiduciary duty when I was sworn into to serve on the committee and served on the investment committees. And I took it very seriously. And so what pension trustees do and what pension plans do is they do something which in academics we love to come up with these kind of $10 phrases for these things. So what we practice is what's called mean variance optimization. So what is that? Well, basically for a given level of return, so say we have to hit a 7% return or a 6.5% return, we try and minimize the variance of the portfolio. So the annual fluctuations, the up and downs, of the value of the portfolio. Said another way, if we have an acceptable level of risk, we try and maximize the return on the portfolio. That's what we did. That's all of our conversations were about that on the boards on which I served. Why do we do this? Well, quite obviously, what we're trying to do is allow either or both the maximum level of benefits for the employees or the minimum cost to the taxpayers, because there's this third party that very few people talk about when they talk about pension plans, and that's the taxpayers, because they're going to have to come up with the money if there's a shortfall in resources for the plans. Next slide. Oops, sorry. So just to talk about the restrictions in general in doing the research on this topic, there's basically three broad categories of restrictions. So the first one are certain asset class type restrictions. So when I was on the board for the city of Omaha many years ago, one of the council people didn't like commodity investments. They thought that they were excessively risky. So they had a prohibition passed so that we couldn't invest in any commodities. And there's similar restrictions out there for things like private equity funds, hedge funds, things like that. The second type might be called issue or security constraints. So this quite often takes the form of saying you can't invest in an asset that has a single issuer. So the best example I have of this is a lot of investments in things like farmland or structured loan funds have one particular company that they're associated with. Those restrictions are pretty obvious why they're there. You don't want necessarily any one particular investment to be made in a company. It has all kinds of problems with transparency and accountability. And then the final type are the ones that are represented and what are being discussed here, and that's either sector or country screens. So sector screens will often take would take the form of a prohibition on things like energy investments, or either a requirement to invest in ESG type investments, or a requirement against investing in ESG, and states have actually passed kind of both of those, and different cities have also. And then obviously the anti-boycott provisions are the ones we're talking about here. Next slide. So what has the academic literature found when I do my research on this topic? what has the literature found about the effects of restrictions in general? Now, I'm going to talk in general. Right now, I asked for a list of investments that had been foregone because of this, and I was not made privy to such a list. And so it's impossible for me to do my own study to figure out what the potential effects might have been in Illinois. But in general, there's been any number of research papers out of organizations like the World Bank, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and several top universities that have found a pattern. In general, when restrictions are put in place, what we tend to see is poorer, what we call risk-adjusted returns. So for a given level of risk, what were the returns? So I gave you the example of the commodity restriction that was on the Omaha plan. Commodities are a relatively risky investment class by themselves, but they have this property, sorry to again get academic on you, but it's called negative correlation. They're negatively correlated with other assets. And so by putting a risky asset like a commodity into a pension plan, you can actually reduce the overall portfolio risk, because as other investments go up, they go down. As commodities go up, the other investments go down. And so that actually kind of evens out. So there's that effect. There's another effect called benchmark drift. Now, all pension plans have to manage against benchmarks. So, for example, on each of the plans I was on, our large cap US equity investments, we benchmarked to something called the Russell 1000 index. It's very similar to something you might know, the S&P 500. Okay. Small cap US were benchmarked to the Russell 2000, international to something called the MSCI index, things like that. When you start removing categories or individual investments out of the portfolio mix, suddenly you're not mirroring your benchmark. And so tracking performance against kind of an objective benchmark becomes a lot more difficult when you do that. And so that creates some problems with, again, managing risk and return in the portfolio. And then finally, the last one are increased administrative costs. You have to have increased costs of monitoring to make sure there's no investments going into a certain asset or something like that. Again, increasing the cost just reduces the benefits you can offer or increases the cost to the taxpayers. Now, there is one mitigating factor that I wanted to point out in the pension code. As I read through the pension code, there is an exclusion for indirect holdings of assets. So an indirect holding would be if a fund invested in a certain asset. So think of it like a mutual fund. That's actually not the way that pensions hold their investments, but it's the closest corollary I can come up with. If a mutual fund invested in an asset of a certain type, they wouldn't necessarily be required to divest. That makes the effects likely to be a lot less than the effects that have been seen in other research. And so with that, I hope I've increased kind of understanding of the role of pensions and what pensions are trying to do and what effects restrictions in general might have on it. As I said, I have no position on the particular bill.
Thank you very much. I do really appreciate you coming up, and I really appreciate your testimony. It is a complicated issue. I will open up to any questions anybody has. Representative Kiker.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate you being here. Just on one of the answers or information you provided, you didn't get a response from any opportunities foregone. Was that due to a confidentiality restriction? Was it a no response? What was the nature of that?
I made the request through the counsel for the committee, and it wasn't provided. I have no idea what.
No reply.
No reply.
Okay.
All right, seeing no other questions, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. And to the committee, I think we all have that in our email, so if we have any more questions, we can just take a look at that. Next, we're going to hear from the proponents. How would you like to, who would like to go first? Please go ahead.